The chamber fell silent as stood before the assembly. Thousands of alien eyes watched him from every direction. Some had compound eyes that glittered like jewels. Others had single large orbs that never blinked. A few species didn't have eyes at all, but they were all focused on the human ambassador standing at the center platform. Had walked this path many times before. For 15 years, he had represented Earth in the Galactic Council. He had negotiated treaties, prevented wars, and helped rebuild civilizations torn apart by conflict. Today would be his last walk down this path. "The human delegation wishes to make an announcement," said. His voice carried through the chamber's translation system, converted instantly into thousands of languages and communication methods. Effective immediately, humanity is withdrawing from all galactic affairs. We are recalling our ambassadors, our peacekeepers, our engineers, and our medical teams. We are ceasing all aid programs and technology sharing initiatives. Earth thanks the Galactic Council for 3 centuries of cooperation, but we will no longer be participating. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the chamber erupted into chaos. A representative rose from her seat, her 4 arms gesturing wildly. "This is unacceptable. You cannot simply abandon your responsibilities." "What responsibilities?" asked calmly. "Please show me the treaty where Earth agreed to provide these services. Show me the contract where we promised to solve everyone's problems." The representative opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no such treaty. There had never been one. Humans had simply helped because that was what humans did. They saw problems and fixed them. They saw suffering and relieved it. For 300 years, the galaxy had taken this for granted. "But the Thoral border negotiations," another delegate shouted. "Your mediators are the only ones keeping them from war." "Then perhaps the Thoral should learn to talk to each other without us," replied. "We taught them negotiation techniques for decades. If they choose not to use those skills, that is their decision." In orbit above the council station, watched the proceedings through a video feed. She commanded the human fleet that protected Earth's interests in this sector. Her ships were already preparing to leave. Around the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out. Human vessels were disengaging from joint patrol routes, withdrawing from disputed territories where they had kept peace, and setting courses for home. "All ships begin withdrawal sequence," ordered. "We're going home." Her officers moved efficiently through their tasks. They had practiced this scenario in secret for months. Every human in galactic space knew this day might come. They were ready. On the planet 5, an engineer named received the recall order in the middle of repairing a power distribution hub. He saved his work, locked down the maintenance systems, and started packing his tools. His counterpart, a being with 6 legs and crystalline skin, watched in confusion. "You are leaving, but the tertiary grid needs next week," the engineer said. "I taught you how to do tertiary grid 4 years ago," replied without looking up from his packing. "The manuals are in the system. The procedures are documented. You can handle it." "But what if something goes wrong?" Paused and finally looked at his former colleague. "Then you'll figure it out. The same way everyone else in the universe figures things out. You'll read the documentation, analyze the problem, and find a solution. You're an intelligent being. You don't need us to hold your hand anymore." The engineer's crystalline surface flickered with colors that indicated distress. "We always had humans to consult when problems arose." "Yes, you did," agreed. "And because you always had us, you never learned to trust your own abilities. Maybe it's time that changed." Back in the council chamber, the debate had devolved into accusations and demands. Representatives from a dozen species were shouting at once, their words blending into incomprehensible noise even for the translation system. Earth's chief diplomat stood beside on the platform. She had spent 20 years building relationships with alien species, learning their customs, understanding their cultures. She had friends among many of these delegates. leaving them hurt but staying hurt more. "Let me be clear about why we're doing this," said, her voice cutting through the noise. The chamber quieted again. 3 centuries ago, when humanity joined the galactic community, we were excited. We thought we would learn from you and you would learn from us. We thought we would build something together. She paused, looking around the chamber. But that's not what happened. You came to us with problems and we solved them. You came to us with conflicts and we mediated them. You came to us with diseases and we cured them. And we did all of this freely because we believed in cooperation and mutual aid. "Then what is the problem?" a delegate demanded. "You helped us and we were grateful." "Were you?" asked quietly. 20 years ago, when the Martian colonies collapsed and millions of humans died, how many of you sent aid? How many of you offered medical assistance or emergency supplies? We had spent 2 centuries helping you, and when we needed help, where were you? The chamber was silent again. Several delegates looked away. "When human scientists make breakthroughs, we share them freely with the galaxy," continued. "When your scientists make breakthroughs, you classify them as state secrets. When we ask for help understanding your technology so we can better assist you, you refuse, citing security concerns. When you don't understand our technology, you demand we explain everything in detail." Took over. Last year, a human medical team saved 3 million lives during the outbreak. Do you know what the government did? They published the research under names and never mentioned the human doctors who developed the treatment. When we protested, we were told we should be honored to have contributed to science. "That is one incident," a representative protested weakly. "No, it's not," said. "It's the pattern. We give and give and give, and you take and take and take. And then you resent us for being needed. We see how you talk about humans when you think we're not listening. We hear the comments about human arrogance, about human interference, about how we think we're better than everyone else." Nodded. "We don't think we're better. We just tried to be good neighbors, but you don't want neighbors. You want servants who work for free and never complain. Well, we're tired of it." "So this is revenge?" a delegate asked. "No," said. "This is self-respect. We're going home. We're going to focus on our own civilization for a while. We're going to rebuild what we've neglected while we were busy fixing your problems. And maybe, when we come back, you'll have learned to value what we offered instead of expecting it as your due." The human delegation walked out of the chamber together. Behind them, the arguments resumed, louder and more desperate than before. But the humans didn't look back. They had said everything that needed saying. On Earth, Prime Minister addressed the planet. "Our people are coming home. The experiment is over. For 3 centuries, we tried to be part of a galactic community. But a community requires mutual respect and reciprocity. We were providing a service, not participating in a partnership. So we're done. Let the galaxy figure out its own problems for a while." Across the Sol system, humans felt a mixture of emotions. Some felt relief. Some felt sadness at leaving friends behind. Some felt anger at how humanity had been treated. But all of them felt something else too, dignity. They had made a choice. They had said no. And that felt powerful. 3 weeks passed since the humans left. The Galactic Council met daily, trying to manage the growing list of problems. But managing problems and solving them were 2 very different things. The Thoral border had been quiet for 30 years. Human mediators had maintained regular dialogue between the 2 species, meeting with both sides every month to discuss concerns before they became conflicts. Small disputes were resolved quickly. Misunderstandings were clarified. Trust was built slowly, conversation by conversation. Now those mediators were gone, and the border was no longer quiet. It started with a mining outpost in the disputed zone. The Thoral claimed they had established it first. The claimed the same. Under human mediation, they had agreed to joint operation with shared profits. But the agreement required quarterly reviews and adjustments, meetings that humans had always facilitated. Without those meetings, the Thoral began suspecting they were taking more than their share. The thought the same about the Thorol. Within a week, both sides had sent military vessels to the outpost. Within 2 weeks, the first shots were fired. The Galactic Council scrambled to mediate. They sent their best diplomats, but these diplomats were used to formal negotiations between species that already wanted peace. They didn't know how to de-escalate a situation where both sides were angry and suspicious. They didn't have the human gift for reading emotions across species barriers, for knowing when to push and when to give space, for finding the common ground that logic alone couldn't reveal. The peace talks collapsed in 18 hours. A delegate made a gesture with their appendages that was meant to show frustration. The Thorol diplomats interpreted it as a threat. The Thorol delegation walked out. By the next day, the border skirmish had escalated into full combat. On Earth, watched the news feeds with a heavy heart. He knew those Thorol and negotiators. He had worked with them for years. They weren't bad people. They were just scared and angry, and there was no one there who knew how to help them pass those emotions. His assistant, a young woman named, stood beside him. "Should we go back? People are dying." "People die every day," said quietly. "The question is, are they dying because we're not there, or are they dying because no one else learned to do what we do? We spent 30 years teaching peace-building techniques. Every tool we used, we explained. Every method we employed, we documented. The knowledge is there. The Thorol and chose not to learn it." "That seems harsh." "Maybe," agreed. "But staying would be harsher in the long run. They need to learn they can't depend on us for everything." The problems weren't limited to the border war. On 5, the power grid was failing. The factories that produced advanced electronics for half the sector were going dark one by one. Watch from his apartment in Seoul. The news showed engineers staring at diagnostic screens, clearly lost. The power distribution system humans had designed was complex but not impossible to understand. Had spent years creating detailed documentation. Every component was labeled. Every process was explained. But the engineers had never actually read that documentation. Why would they, when they could just call a human consultant? Now they were discovering that the systems were more intricate than they had assumed. They didn't understand the redundancy protocols or the load balancing algorithms. They saw the surface level but not the underlying logic. "It hurts to watch," said. She had worked on 5 too. "It does," agreed. "But watch what happens next. They're bringing in their best engineers. They're actually reading the documentation now. They're learning. It's painful, but it's growth." The agricultural planet was facing a crisis of its own. Humans had introduced modified grain strains decades ago, varieties that thrived in unusual soil chemistry. These grains had ended famine on and allowed their population to triple. But the grains required specific farming techniques, crop rotation patterns to maintain soil nutrients, specific timing for planting based on soil temperature, not calendar dates, integrated pest management that used natural predators instead of chemical treatments. Human agricultural advisors had taught all of this, year after year. The farmers had learned to follow instructions. Plant here, rotate there, monitor these insects. They did exactly what humans told them to do, but they never learned why they were doing it. They never understood the science behind the methods. Now the advisors were gone. The farmers planted at the times they had always planted, not noticing that weather patterns had shifted slightly. They didn't rotate crops properly because they didn't understand why rotation mattered. They saw pest insects and panicked, using chemical treatments that killed the beneficial insects too. The crops began to fail. Blight spread through the fields. Within a month, food supplies were in serious danger. A human agricultural scientist named watched the reports from Earth. She had spent 10 years on. She had tried so hard to teach the farmers to understand the systems, not just follow procedures. But every time she explained the science, the farmers would nod politely and then ask her to just tell them what to do. "I could fix this in a week," she said to her colleague, I know exactly what they're doing wrong." "I know you could," replied. "But should you? Remember what happened last time you helped them. You proposed establishing an agricultural university to teach the science properly. The government rejected it. They said having humans teach farming methods was cultural imperialism. They accused you of thinking weren't smart enough to farm their own planet." Remembered, the accusation had hurt deeply because it was so unfair. She didn't think they were stupid. She thought they were intelligent people who deserved to understand the tools they were using. But they had refused to learn, and now they were suffering for it. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. They needed to address the growing list of crises. Trade routes were experiencing problems because the quantum communication network, designed by humans, was developing glitches no one else understood how to fix. Medical emergencies were arising because human doctors were no longer available for consultation. Research projects were stalling because human scientists were no longer sharing their latest findings. The Council voted to send a formal delegation to Earth. They drafted a message demanding that humanity return to fulfill its obligations. The word "demanding" appeared 17 times in the document. The delegation arrived at the Sol system border, where human defense satellites tracked their every move. They transmitted their message and waited for Earth's response. Minyu, who had taken over as the primary human contact for galactic affairs, received the delegation via video link. He read their message carefully, then looked into the camera. "Earth's response is simple," Minyu said. "We have no obligations. Every service we provided was voluntary. We chose to help because we value cooperation and mutual aid. But cooperation requires both sides to contribute. Mutual aid requires both sides to aid each other. For 3 centuries, the aid only flowed one direction. That is not cooperation. That is exploitation." "You are condemning millions to suffering," the lead delegate protested. "No," Minyu said calmly. "You are condemning them to suffering by never learning to help yourselves. We offered to teach you. We documented everything. We created educational programs and training systems. You refused to learn because it was easier to just call us. Well, now you don't have that option anymore. This is cruelty. This is consequences," Minyu replied. "You took us for granted. You assumed we would always be there to solve your problems. You resented us for being needed but never tried to become less dependent on us. Now you're discovering what that dependence cost you." The delegation tried to argue further, but Minyu ended the transmission. Earth's position was clear. Humanity would not be returning. Back on Earth, people followed the news from the galaxy with mixed feelings. Some felt guilty about the suffering. Others felt vindicated that their contributions were finally being recognized, even if only through their absence. Most felt a combination of both. Prime Minister addressed the nation again. "I know this is hard. I know some of you want to go back and help. Your compassion honors you. But compassion without boundaries becomes exploitation. We tried to help the galaxy grow. Instead, we became a crutch that prevented growth. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is step back and let someone learn to stand on their own." The galaxy was learning that lesson now, and it was proving to be very painful indeed. 2 months had passed since humanity. The galaxy was breaking down in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. The Galactic Trade Network, the communication system that connected thousands of worlds, was experiencing cascading failures. Human engineers had designed the quantum routing protocols that made faster-than-light communication possible across such vast distances. The system was brilliant in its complexity, using quantum entanglement in ways that other species had never imagined. But complexity required understanding, and no one had bothered to truly understand it. When humans explained the system, other species had nodded and taken notes, but they never asked the deeper questions. They never tried to grasp the underlying principles. They just learned which buttons to push and which warnings to ignore. Now a critical relay station in the sector had malfunctioned. The alien technicians stared at screens full of human-designed code, trying to understand what they were seeing. The commands were documented, yes, but documentation told you what something did, not why it did it or how to fix it when it broke. They tried standard diagnostic procedures. Nothing worked. They tried rebooting the entire station. The problem persisted. Trade routes that passed through the sector went dark. Trillions of credits in commerce ground to a halt. Worlds that depended on imported food and medicine found their supply lines cut. The technicians sent desperate messages to other relay stations, hoping someone else had encountered this problem before. No one had. This particular failure was unique, the kind of edge case that required creative problem-solving and deep system knowledge. The kind of problem humans had always fixed within hours. On Earth, a communications engineer named saw the technical specs that had been posted publicly as a plea for help. She understood the problem immediately. A cascade failure in the quantum buffer system, probably caused by a microscopic variation in the entanglement field generator. The fix would take about 20 minutes if you knew what you were doing. She started to draft a response, then stopped herself. Last time she had helped with a trade network problem, the species involved had implemented her solution, then published a technical paper claiming they had discovered the fix themselves. When she protested, they said her contribution had been informal consultation that didn't warrant formal credit. Closed the technical specs and went back to her coffee. Let them figure it out. The medical crisis on them was getting worse. A virus had emerged 3 months ago, shortly before humanity. It was a nasty one, attacking the respiratory system in ways that made treatment difficult. Under normal circumstances, human doctors would have been called in immediately. Human medicine had a reputation across the galaxy for its speed and innovation. While medical research was thorough and methodical, human doctors seemed to make intuitive leaps that cut months off the research process. They saw patterns that others missed. They tried unconventional combinations of treatments that somehow worked. Now, without human consultation, doctors were following their traditional research protocols. Systematic testing of potential treatments, careful analysis of results, peer review at every stage. It was good science, but it was slow science. And while they followed their procedures, the death toll climbed into the millions. Who had worked on diseases for years, watched the news reports with a sick feeling in her stomach. She recognized this virus. She had seen similar ones before. She could have the treatment protocol designed in hours, not months. Her partner found her crying in their kitchen. "You want to help them?" "Of course I want to help them," said. "People are dying. Children are dying. I have the knowledge that could save them." "Remember the outbreak?" asked gently. "You worked 72 hours straight to develop that treatment. You saved 3 million lives, and the government took all the credit. They published your research under their scientists' names. They never mentioned you or any of the human medical team." "I didn't do it for credit," said. "I know," replied, "but they didn't value what you did. They treated it as their right to have your help. And when you asked for acknowledgement, they acted like you were being petty. Do you really think anything has changed?" Didn't answer because they both knew the truth. Nothing had changed. They were sorry they didn't have human help available, but they weren't sorry about how they had treated that help when they had it. The Galactic Defense Coalition was discovering its own problems. When pirates began raiding Outer Rim colonies, the Coalition assembled a task force to stop them. The task force was large, well-equipped, and followed all standard military protocols. And the pirates ran circles around them. The Coalition's tactics were predictable. They followed doctrine precisely, which meant any enemy who had studied that doctrine knew exactly what they would do. The task force would arrive at a raided colony, establish a perimeter, conduct a thorough investigation, analyze probable escape vectors, and then pursue using the most logical route. By the time they finished their analysis, the pirates were 3 systems away hitting another target. Watched from Earth with professional frustration. She had served in the Galactic Defense Coalition for 20 years. She understood why this was happening. Humans had made up only 15% of coalition forces, but they had held far more command positions than that percentage would suggest. The reason was simple: human tactical thinking was different. Most species approached military problems logically and systematically. They analyzed the situation, considered the options, and chose the optimal course of action based on established principles. It was effective, but it was also predictable. Human commanders operated on what the other species called intuition, but was really pattern recognition operating at a subconscious level. They could look at a tactical situation and just know what the enemy would do next, not because they had analyzed all the possibilities, but because something about the pattern felt familiar. They improvised, adapted, took risks that the mathematical models said were suboptimal but somehow worked anyway. Now, without human tactical flexibility, the coalition was discovering that optimal strategies based on perfect information were useless when the information was incomplete and the enemy didn't cooperate with your models. Across the galaxy, the pattern repeated itself. Systems that humans had designed or maintained were failing. Problems that humans had solved were recurring. Services that humans had provided were revealed to be irreplaceable. The Galactic Council met in continuous session now, trying to coordinate responses to the cascading crises. They had formed committees to address each major problem. The committees were filled with the best minds from dozens of species. But committees were slow. They debated, analyzed, sought consensus, and then debated some more. Meanwhile, the Thora War had spread to 5 systems. The plague had killed 8 million. The trade network was operating at 35% capacity. Food shortages were developing on a dozen agricultural worlds. Medical emergencies were going untreated. Engineering projects were stalling. Some species began to understand what had happened. The representative, an experienced diplomat named, spent his evenings reviewing the history of human involvement in galactic affairs. He made lists of every crisis humans had resolved, every innovation they had shared, every service they had provided. The lists were staggeringly long. For 3 centuries, humans had been everywhere doing everything, solving problems large and small. They had been so helpful, so available, so willing to assist that everyone had simply assumed they always would be. Realized with growing horror that his own species had been among the worst offenders. They prided themselves on their diplomatic skills, yet when complex negotiations required a human mediator, they called it utilizing available resources, rather than admitting they needed help. When humans shared technology, they studied it enough to use it but never enough to truly understand it. Why bother when humans would maintain it for free? He began drafting a letter, not an official communication from the government but a personal message from one person to another. He wrote to the former human ambassador. In the letter, admitted what he had never admitted before. They had taken advantage of human generosity. They had treated human brilliance as a resource to exploit rather than a gift to appreciate. They had resented humanity for being necessary while simultaneously making themselves dependent on human help. It was hypocritical and shameful, and was sorry. He didn't ask for humanity to return. He didn't make promises about how things would be different. He just apologized, one person to another, for his own failure to see what was right in front of him. On Earth, received the letter. He read it 3 times, looking for hidden agendas or manipulation. He found none. It was just an honest apology from someone who had finally understood what they had lost. Didn't respond immediately. He needed time to think about what this meant. One person understanding wasn't enough, but it was a start. And starts were important, even small ones. The galaxy continued to struggle, but somewhere in that struggle, seeds of change were beginning to grow. People were learning to help each other because they had no choice. Species were sharing knowledge because hoarding it meant everyone suffered. And slowly, painfully, the galaxy was discovering what it meant to function without the humans they had taken for granted for so long. The lesson was hard, but perhaps hard lessons were the only ones that truly stuck. 4 months into the withdrawal, the Galactic Council was splitting apart. The cracks had been there for a long time, but humanity's absence had turned those cracks into chasms. The Dominion led one faction. They were a proud species, warriors and builders who had conquered half their spiral arm before joining the galactic community. The idea that they needed humans, that any single species could be so essential, was intolerable to them. "We don't need humanity," the Prime Minister declared in a heated council session. "We survived for millions of years before they arrived. We will survive after they leave. This crisis is temporary. We simply need to pool our resources and knowledge. Together, we can replace whatever the humans provided." It sounded good. It sounded strong. Several other species applauded. Then came the attempt to actually do it. They organized a joint research initiative. They would recreate human medical diagnostic systems, the AI programs that could analyze symptoms and identify diseases with remarkable speed and accuracy. They assembled the best programmers from 20 different species. They gave them unlimited funding and resources. They set a deadline of 3 months. 3 months later, they had a system that worked at roughly 30% of human capability. It could diagnose common diseases if given very specific symptom information. It struggled with unusual cases. It missed subtle patterns that human-designed systems caught immediately. And it was slow, taking hours to process what human systems handled in minutes. Meanwhile, thousands continued dying from diseases that better diagnostic systems would have caught. The researchers tried to improve their program, but they were building on a foundation they didn't fully understand. Human medical AI wasn't just programmed. It was trained using techniques that combined neuroscience, psychology, and computer science in ways that other species were still trying to figure out. The other faction was led by the who had no pride left to salvage. Their people were starving. Their government had spent weeks trying to fix the agricultural crisis themselves, bringing in their best farmers and scientists. Nothing worked. The crops continued to fail. Food reserves were running out. The ambassador addressed the council with desperation in his voice. "We need help. We are dying. Our children are dying. We cannot fix this alone. We need the humans to come back." "You want to beg?" a representative asked with contempt. "Yes," the ambassador said simply. "I want to beg. I want to plead. I want to get on my knees if that's what it takes. Pride doesn't feed hungry children." On Earth received this official plea. It came with video messages from families showing their thin children and empty food stores. The images hurt to watch. She had friends on. She had shared meals with those families. She thought about 5 years ago when she had proposed establishing an agricultural university on. The idea was to teach farmers not just the techniques but the science behind them, to give them the knowledge to adapt and innovate on their own. The government had rejected the proposal with hostility. They said humans were being condescending, implying that weren't capable of understanding advanced agriculture. They accused her of cultural imperialism. Some politicians had made speeches about how humanity thought other species were primitive and needed to be educated like children. The irony burned. They had rejected the chance to learn because they thought it insulted their intelligence. Now they were begging because they couldn't solve problems they had refused to understand. Didn't respond to the message. She forwarded it to Prime Minister with a note. "This is what we tried to prevent." The Galactic Council tried making offers to Earth. They sent messages daily, each one promising something different. "We will give you better trade terms," one message said. Read it and laughed. Earth didn't need better trade terms. Human industry had become so advanced during the withdrawal that they were now self-sufficient in almost everything. The resources they used to import, they could now synthesize or substitute. "We will share our technology with you," another message promised. "Pass this one to the Science Ministry." They reviewed the offered technology and reported back. Most of it was decades behind current human capabilities. The few items that were interesting, humanity could develop themselves given time. "We will give you greater authority in the Council," a third message offered. "Humanity can have veto power over all Council decisions." Deleted this message without reading past the first paragraph. Humans didn't want authority over other species. They never had. They just wanted to be treated as equals, not as servants or superiors. Every offer was based on the assumption that humans wanted something material from the galaxy. None of them understood that what humanity had wanted was respect and reciprocity, things you couldn't trade or negotiate. On Earth, addressed the planet in another broadcast. "The galaxy keeps asking what it will take for us to return. They offer us resources, technology, power. They don't understand that we left because they never valued what we gave freely. We shared knowledge and they hoarded theirs. We helped in crises and they ignored ours. We treated them as partners and they treated us as tools." She paused, looking directly into the camera. "We will return to the galaxy someday, but only when they're ready to treat us as equals. Not because they need us, but because they respect us. Not because they want what we can give them, but because they value what we choose to share. Until then, we're staying home." The message spread across Earth to mixed reactions. Some people agreed completely. Others worried about the suffering in the galaxy. Many felt conflicted, understanding the reasoning but still feeling guilty. A young diplomat named organized a forum to discuss the issue. Thousands participated, debating the ethics of the withdrawal. Some argued that helping people in need was a moral obligation that transcended concerns about respect. Others countered that enabling dependency was itself a form of harm. The debate was intense but thoughtful. This was humanity trying to understand itself, trying to figure out who they wanted to be. There were no easy answers. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening in the galaxy. The initial chaos was giving way to adaptation. Species were being forced to help each other because no one else would. The who had rarely provided aid to anyone sent food shipments too. It wasn't charity exactly. They needed minerals for their industry and couldn't mine if they were starving, but the effect was the same. Help was being given. The surprising everyone shared medical research with not their most advanced research, but some techniques that might help with the plague. The Thoral, their enemies, were furious that they were aiding other species while at war. But the Prime Minister gave a simple explanation. "They are dying. We have knowledge that might save them. What kind of species would we be if we it?" The Thoral, shamed by this, declared a temporary ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid to reach civilian populations on both sides of the war. It wasn't peace, but it was something. Small acts of cooperation were spreading. An engineering team helped repair the trade network relay station. They didn't succeed, but they learned a lot trying, and they documented what they learned for others. A coalition of medical researchers from 6 species began working together on the plague, sharing information and insights in ways they had never done before. It was clumsy and inefficient compared to what humans had provided, but it was genuine. Species were learning that they could help each other, that they had to help each other because no one else was coming to save them. On Earth, who directed the Science Ministry, was tracking these developments carefully. "They're learning," he said to his staff. "It's painful and slow, but they're actually learning to cooperate." "Do you think it will last?" someone asked. "I don't know," admitted. "People change when circumstances force them to, but when circumstances ease, they often slide back into old patterns. The question is whether they're changing who they are or just changing what they do." That question hung in the air, unanswered. Only time would tell if the galaxy was truly changing or just adapting temporarily to survive. But for the first time since the withdrawal began, there was hope. Not certainty, but hope. And sometimes hope was enough to start with. 6 months had passed since humanity from galactic affairs. The galaxy had changed in ways that surprised everyone, including the humans who had left it behind. The TerraLorn War had finally ended, not through a negotiated peace, but through exhaustion. Both species had fought themselves to a standstill, spending resources they couldn't afford to replace. When they finally agreed to talk, there were no human mediators present. They talked to each other directly, awkwardly, making mistakes and misunderstandings. But they talked, and eventually they found a compromise that both could accept. It wasn't elegant or ideal, but it was theirs. They had done it themselves. The plague had run its course. Millions had died, a terrible cost. But the medical researchers, working with scientists from 6 other species, had developed a treatment. It took them 5 months instead of the weeks human doctors might have managed, but they had done it. And in doing it, they had learned to work together in ways they never had before. The galactic economy had contracted by 40%. Worlds that had imported everything were learning to produce locally. Trade routes that had depended on the human-designed quantum network were using older, slower methods. It was less efficient, but it worked. Small wars and conflicts still erupted regularly, but something had shifted. Species were learning to resolve disputes without waiting for outside intervention. The Galactic Defense Coalition was adapting its tactics, incorporating some of the flexibility that human commanders had once provided. They weren't as good at it, but they were improving. Most importantly, species were helping each other. Not perfectly, not generously, but genuinely. When they faced a natural disaster, 3 neighboring species sent aid without being asked. When they needed rare minerals for an industrial project, they offered to trade despite past disputes. Small acts of cooperation were becoming normal instead of exceptional. On Earth, compiled reports on these changes and presented them to Prime Minister. "They're learning," he said. "The galaxy is different than it was 6 months ago." "Different enough?" asked. "That's not for me to decide," replied. "But they're trying, that counts for something." The Galactic Council had indeed dissolved and reformed. The new organization was called the Galactic Community, and its charter was fundamentally different from its predecessor. It acknowledged the right of all member species to refuse service, to set boundaries, and to prioritize their own needs. It established reciprocity protocols that required species receiving aid to provide aid when able. Technology sharing was supposed to be mutual, not one way. The charter looked good on paper. Whether it would work in practice remained to be seen. A delegation from the new community requested permission to enter the Sol system. They wanted to discuss humanity's possible return. Prime Minister agreed to meet them, but at the system border, not on Earth itself. She wasn't ready to welcome them home yet. The delegation was led by the diplomat who had written to months earlier. He brought representatives from a dozen species, each chosen for their genuine commitment to change rather than their political influence. Met them via holographic conference, with and several other advisors present. The first thing she noticed was that none of them looked arrogant or demanding. They looked tired and humbled, which was a start. "We're here to ask if humanity would consider rejoining galactic civilization," said, "under the new charter with new terms as true equals." "Why should we believe things will be different?" asked bluntly. "Your charter is just words. Words are easy to write and easier to break." "You're right to be skeptical," admitted. "We've given you no reason to trust us. For 3 centuries we took from you without giving back. We resented you for being helpful. We treated your gifts as entitlements. Words alone cannot undo that." "Then what can?" asked. "Time," said the representative. "And proof. We're not asking you to trust us immediately. We're asking you to give us the chance to demonstrate that we've changed. Return gradually. Watch us. Test us. At the first sign that we're falling back into old patterns, leave again. We'll accept that. Was quiet for a long moment. What you're asking for is conditional cooperation. We help, but only as long as you hold up your end. Yes, said. That's exactly what we're asking for. That's what it should have been from the beginning, replied. Cooperation has to be mutual. The moment it becomes one-sided, it's not cooperation anymore. It's exploitation. The delegation members nodded. Some of them looked ashamed, which suggested they understood this lesson on a personal level, not just an intellectual one. Back on Earth, the government debated for 3 weeks. The discussion was intense and divided. Some people argued that the galaxy had suffered enough and needed help. Others insisted that 6 months wasn't long enough to ensure lasting change. The young diplomat gave an impassioned speech at a public forum. I know we were hurt. I know we were taken advantage of, but we to teach a lesson, not to punish forever. The galaxy has learned something. Maybe not everything, maybe not permanently, but something real has changed. If we refuse to give them a chance to prove it, what does that say about us? Her words resonated with many, but not everyone. A more cautious voice responded, "Compassion is important, but so is wisdom. If we return too soon, we risk teaching the wrong lesson. We risk showing that if the galaxy simply waits long enough, humans will always come back and fix things. That's not change. That's just patience." Both had valid points. The debate continued. Finally, made her decision. Humanity would return to the galaxy, but on specific terms. The return would happen in phases, starting small and expanding only if the new system worked. Human services would resume gradually, with regular evaluations. Any species or organization that began treating humans as servants rather than partners would lose access to human cooperation immediately. Most importantly, humanity reserved the right to withdraw again, permanently, if the galaxy backslid into old patterns. This wasn't a negotiation. These were the conditions. Take them or leave them. The galactic community accepted immediately. The first phase began with medical services. Human doctors returned to crisis zones, including the worlds where plague aftereffects still needed treatment. But they went as consultants, not saviors. They worked alongside local doctors, teaching as much as treating. When locals asked them to just solve the problem, the humans refused. "We'll teach you how to solve it," they said, "but you have to do the work." Some species found this frustrating. They wanted quick solutions, not lessons. Those species lost access to human medical services and had to figure things out themselves. Others embraced the opportunity to learn. Those species found that human doctors were incredibly generous teachers when their students genuinely wanted to learn. Returned to his role as ambassador, but the job was different now. When he walked into the new community council chamber, the other ambassadors stood up. It was a sign of respect that had never happened before. It was a small thing, but small things mattered. His first mediation was between two species with a minor trade dispute. In the old days, they would have immediately deferred to his judgment. Now, they presented their arguments directly to each other first, trying to find common ground themselves. Only when they got stuck did they ask for input. "You're doing well," told them. "You almost had it. The issue is that you're both focused on fairness, but you're defining fairness differently. Let me explain how you're each thinking about it, and you can decide which definition to use." He explained both perspectives. The two species looked at each other with new understanding and quickly reached an agreement. Had barely done anything except help them understand each other. That was how mediation should work. On 5, returned to find local engineers who had been studying the documentation he'd left behind. They were still struggling with complex problems, but they understood so much more than they had 6 months ago. When arrived, they didn't ask him to fix things. They showed him what they had tried and asked him to explain where they had gone wrong. "This is good work," said, genuinely impressed. "You're thinking about the systems correctly now. Let me show you a more efficient approach, and then you can try implementing it yourselves." They worked together, humans and as partners. It felt right in a way it never had before. Not everything went smoothly. Some species tried to take advantage, expecting humans to be pushovers who would accept mistreatment rather than walk away again. They learned quickly that this was not the case. When an administrator tried to blame a human engineer for a problem they had caused themselves, the entire human engineering team left that planet immediately. The government had to issue a formal apology and guarantee better treatment before any human would return. The message spread. Humans were back, but they weren't pushovers anymore. They would help gladly, but only in partnerships built on respect. Months turned into years. The galaxy adjusted to the new normal. Human services were available but not unlimited. Human knowledge was shared but required genuine effort to learn. Human mediation was offered but not imposed. The relationship between humanity and the rest of the galaxy had fundamentally shifted from dependency to partnership. It wasn't perfect. Old patterns occasionally resurfaced, and humans had to remind people that they could leave again. Some species never fully adapted and remained resentful of the new dynamic. A few conflicts escalated because humans refused to intervene the way they once had. But overall, the galaxy was healthier. Species were more self-sufficient, more willing to help each other, and more respectful of boundaries. The crisis had taught lessons that peace and prosperity never could. Stood in the community council chamber years after his return, watching delegates from 100 species working through a complex problem together. No one was waiting for humans to solve it. They were solving it themselves, with humans contributing as one voice among many. He caught eye across the chamber. The diplomats smiled and nodded. They both understood what they had built here. Not a galaxy that needed humanity, but a galaxy that valued humanity. Not a civilization dependent on human genius, but one enriched by human partnership. It had taken a catastrophe to get here. Humanity had to walk away to show the galaxy what it was losing. The galaxy had to fall apart to understand what it had taken for granted. But now, finally, they were building something better, something sustainable, something worth being part of. The lesson had been painful for everyone, but the lesson had been learned. And that made all the difference.